Thank you very much. How are y'all doing? Good. It is a pleasure to be back. I got to say that the library changes they've made are absolutely gorgeous. I hope you all got a chance to see the videos. They did a phenomenal job. The exhibits are great, and it's really important to have presidential libraries be a place that people in the community use and just to teach history. I think that's one of the things that I'm deeply passionate about, is the importance of all of us learning from history. Kind of with the full 360. You know, you don't need the perfect version of it, because that makes it, I think, the wisdom of history a little less accessible. When I was walking through the exhibits, I was reminded of something that occurred to me a few days ago, which is that I happened to have been born the night before Richard Nixon's second inaugural. And I remember my mother always telling me about how, you know, the troops came home from Vietnam. There was a big announcement in the paper that day. And I had the privilege of knowing Ray Price a bit, who had been Richard Nixon's speechwriter. And Ray is an extraordinary gentleman, and he has the distinction of being, I suppose, the only American to have worked on 2 inaugurations and 1 resignation speech. But what was also great about Ray, and I think it speaks to the complexity of the times and the crew, is that he was also friends with Jack Kerouac and Richard Nixon, which I find very endearing. But you know, when you watch the clip of the '68 inaugural, I think you're reminded something that some of the pop culture representations of Nixon miss. I do think he's seen as a more complex figure appropriately today. But you know, there was a real eloquence and gravity to the man. He really did understand policy and care deeply about policy. And I think what's most resonant, and it's evident if you listen to his inaugural addresses, is that he really had not only appreciation of history, but he thought about America as a civilization. He thought generationally. And even though it was a deeply contentious and divided time, and I think sometimes we dramatically underestimate today, those of us who are too young to live it, how fractured American society was at the time. And I recommend to you a recent book that I thought was excellent called The President and the Professor, about Daniel Patrick Moynihan, great senator and later, and his service in the Nixon administration. And I think that was a sense of the coalitions that were being created. And Moynihan was picked up by the Nixon team in part because he'd given a speech called The Politics of Stability. And he talked about how liberals at the time needed to work with conservatives they could find common ground with to create stability, because the time was so fractured, so divided. And frankly, there was just much more discord, not only cultural, but there was real violence going on at the time that we don't remember so much today. And I think that thinking about America with a sense of perspective, drawing on history, is so important and so valuable, and something we don't do enough of today. But now I would argue is exactly the kind of time when we need to do it. It's precisely when, I think, things can feel unsettled and a stormy present, that we need history to give us perspective on the politics of our time. Because, of course, politics is the area we have the least perspective about, especially it feels today. But history teaches us, of course, that we've been through discordant times in the past, and connecting to first principles, knowing your history, thinking about the rhythms that exist in history, that can give you a really firm foundation to stand on as a citizen. I think we need to teach civics more, but we also need to inject more history and perspective in our politics. We'll have an elevated conversation about what it means to be active citizens. And that's in part why I wrote Washington's Farewell. Washington's Farewell Address was a document written, even though it was only 20 years after the Declaration of Independence, the end of Washington's second term. Washington and the Founding Fathers were already thinking about America with a sense of perspective and a sense of history. And the success of the American experiment was far from a foregone conclusion. In fact, most people believed that we would go rapidly down the path that most democratic republics had throughout history. And that cynic's view, with all the colonial powers waiting in the wings for us to screw up so they could come back and recolonize North America, which is true. Remember, you had the Spanish in Florida and Georgia. You had Britain, and we still had forts in western the United States in addition to Canada. You had the French down. in Louisiana. I mean, people were assuming that we would fail. And Madison and Hamilton and Washington, who are the real authors of the farewell address, took the challenges of history very seriously. They studied, in advance of the Constitutional Convention, how democratic republics had failed before, particularly in ancient Greece and Rome. They were obsessed with learning classical wisdom. But they were studying history so that they could anticipate those problems and try to create frameworks that could act as a bulwark against drifting down those paths. And when Washington started writing his farewell address at the end of his first term, he wanted to retire. He drew on Madison, who was at that time his closest aide, and started writing a document about the importance of national unity. And already there were deep debates in the country about whether states' rights and states' identities should be preeminent over national unity and a centralized government. Remember, Washington becomes president not immediately after the Revolution. He becomes president after the failure of the Articles of Confederation. And they failed because there was not a strong enough bond between the states. Washington and Madison and Hamilton's analysis was there wasn't a strong enough central government to really withstand, and they could see the American experiment sliding toward the failures that reflected other democratic republics in the past. And so they were very much informed, even at the Constitutional Convention, especially at the Constitutional Convention, about creating checks on those larger historical trends. And while Washington wanted to retire after his first term, he was convinced that he couldn't. Jefferson and Hamilton already hated each other. But the one thing they could agree on was that Washington could not retire, because if he did, the country would erupt into civil war, even then. And Washington was aware of that as well. He was a reluctant president. He was a modest man, but that was not false modesty. But he knew that only he was seen as being above politics, above party. Not incidentally, he was our nation's first and only independent president. He refused to join a political party. We sometimes forget that the Constitution doesn't mention political parties. I always say to folks, it does mention journalists, but it doesn't mention political parties. But come at the end of his second term, Washington was tired. He was a man in real physical and psychic pain. He was deeply worried about the way that the two parties were already beginning to emerge in embryo, that his most talented surrogate sons in the cabinet were fighting outright, that the politicization over the question of the French Revolution had torn the country apart. He wanted America to remain neutral, a foreign policy of independence. He wanted to walk a middle ground between monarchy and the mob. But already you had people, including Madison and Jefferson particularly, who were advocating on France's behalf, who were excusing the violence of the French Revolution and encouraging agents to come into the country to try to subvert Washington's government. There were riots and insurrection and newspaper cartoons about Washington being led up the guillotine as King Louis XVI had only a short time before. So it was a contentious time. And Washington sat down to write the farewell address at the end of his second term, working with Hamilton primarily, although he ends up bringing in John Jay at the end, so he gets the Federalist Papers authors, he gets the band back together. And I think that itself is a metaphor for how he wanted to create a document that could unite the nation. But he wanted to do two things. First of all, we underestimate sometimes the extent to which leaving power itself was a revolutionary act. By setting the two-term tradition and voluntarily leaving power and the peaceful transfer of power, that's Washington's final revolutionary act. He wanted to write his goodbye letter to a newspaper. He wanted an open letter, not to give it to members of Congress. He wanted to really draw a distinction between the traditions of European kings. But he also didn't want to simply write about, here's what I've done. He didn't want to write about himself. It was a forward-looking document, what he called the warnings of a parting friend. So he's consciously trying to balance and draw upon the past, the present, and the future. He's drawing on the lessons of his presidency, the lessons of his life, also his understanding of history. And he explicitly is writing not only for citizens at that time, but future generations. George Washington is writing to us. And he specifically delineates three forces he felt could destroy our democratic republic if we weren't careful. Hyperpartisanship, excessive debt, and foreign wars. All three things that we are dealing with actively today. And hyperpartisanship, the founders would have said faction. But they were deeply concerned about the rise of narrowly self-interested partisan factions that would start elevating special interests over the national interest, that would create dysfunctional democracies to such an extent that average citizens would become frustrated with the efficiency and effectiveness of their government, and that could open the door to a demagogue with authoritarian ambitions. He warned about the rise of regional political parties. He warned against those folks who would try to divide Americans against each other. He called them pretend patriots. Because he knew sometimes they would come arguing that they were the most patriotic of all. Sometimes they would come arguing that we had alliances with other countries that should be preeminent. But Washington's focus was resolutely on national unity, building a national identity. He was trying to perfect his own character and build a national character at the same time. Excessive debt, I think, illustrates one of the things about the speech that doesn't only tap into that larger sense of history, but the way that Washington's farewell address remains a document that can unite the left and right. Washington understood the specter of debt in a very personal way. It insulted and infuriated him because it was a restriction on his own freedom. And he had wrestled with debt all his life. Even when he goes to take the oath of office in New York City in 1789, he's got to pay off debts, and he's going around to neighbors trying to borrow money. And a lot of them won't give it to him. During the Revolutionary War, when he and Hamilton start solidifying their bond together, their politics become formed in that crucible as well. They're both deeply frustrated with the ineffectiveness of the Continental Congress. They're also deeply constrained by debt. They don't have any money. The currency is actually being debased as part of a war tactic by the British. Ultimately, what bails us out is we get a loan from, obviously, France, but also the Dutch. And we couldn't afford bullets, we couldn't afford shoes, all of a sudden we could. Washington and Hamilton knew that even something as visceral as war often has a fiscal basis. And there are a lot of heroes in that story, particularly Robert Morris, who's a fascinating figure who basically was the financier of the Revolution, who ended didn't literally end his life, but the last years of his life in a debtor's prison. And Washington visited him, and it's a very poignant story I'll get into a little bit later. But Washington and Hamilton knew that excessive debt, was a force that could topple empires. It always had. Now, Washington became a bit of a convert to the idea that a little bit of debt could be a very good thing for building a nation. But he warned that if we would stop being able to pay off our debt, then we give our destiny in the hands of someone else. And that was repugnant to him, because he realized that always had toppled empires before. And finally, foreign wars. Washington's farewell address, if it's known at all today, is often handed down in the shorthand of avoided tangling alliances. So I see some of you nodding. That phrase actually does not appear in the farewell address. That's from Jefferson's first inaugural. Jefferson, who spent so long fighting Washington tooth and nail over policy, the second he becomes president, takes the oath of office, he's a born-again Washingtonian. And it's really pretty profound. His first inaugural, which is a great speech, basically re-articulates all of the farewell address. But Washington was not arguing for isolation, as many people have assumed, and as many battles have been fought over the legacy of the farewell address. He was arguing for a foreign policy of independence. And that's a consistent theme. It's a political philosophy of independence. It's a foreign policy of independence. What he wants is for America to get at least 20 years, he writes, to grow stronger economically and militarily so we can stand on the world stage as an independent nation in our own right, so that we can become self-sufficient and not simply become a satellite of other countries' interests. And that's why he wanted to remain neutral in that struggle. He didn't want to have to be dragged in on one side, the French or the British, because then we were simply a proxy rather than being taken seriously. That was a subject of bitter disagreement at the time, and it has been perhaps overestimated at different points in our history. He wanted commercial relations with all nations, political connections with none. But he also said once we're independent enough, we can make decisions about whether we should be involved in greater wars based on our concept of self-interest and justice at that time. So it's not a straitjacket, but it's a principle. What is most relevant, though, And when I was writing the book, you read Foreign Wars and you wonder, well, how would he have felt about Iraq? How would he have felt about Vietnam? I mean, these are all hypotheticals, but they're interesting to indulge sometime. What I didn't appreciate, what I couldn't have appreciated, is how one of Washington's real obsessions in the era of foreign policy would come back with roaring rip from the headline relevance, which is when Washington warns quite obsessively and acutely about how foreign powers would try to infiltrate and influence domestic politics and opinion to try to subvert our sovereignty. Now, Vladimir Putin didn't make up this playbook all by himself. Washington's warning about this is actually rooted in the lessons of ancient Greece. I'm going to take you all the way back to King Philip of Macedon. He's the father of Alexander the Great. And the Greek city-states were very good about creating unified blocks of little democratic republics in opposition to a common enemy. But once that common enemy faded, well, they started fighting among themselves. They didn't think about what united them. They thought about what divided them. They weren't a united state sufficiently. And King Philip of Macedon would come in and start giving a little foreign aid and buying off a couple of politicians and slowly sort of infiltrating the debates and create a divided sense of purpose and really exacerbate those divisions, weaken the unity of the state, then come in and conquer it. That was the playbook that Madison reflected on, particularly in the notes he brought to the Constitutional Convention. If you read the Federalist Papers, Hamilton and Madison are both referring to these fairly obscure, ancient Greek city-states, Lycia. And it's because these lessons are really preeminent, particularly the dangers of faction and foreign influence. In Washington's own time, Poland, one of the many countries that was inspired by the United States, writes the first written constitution in Europe. They're a fairly small country, as the history of Poland throughout the 20th century has shown us, squeezed between big powers. And Russia starts buying off some folks in the parliament, weakening the resolve and blurring the national interest. And Poland starts agreeing to a series of partitions that reduce it to a skeletal state between Russia and Prussia. That also is in mind. The parliamentary democracy becomes paralyzed because it's so polarized. And Russia takes great advantage of that. And then in the debates about the French Revolution, while Hamilton and Jefferson particularly are simply awed by the idealistic notion of expanding empire of liberty, and Jefferson fancies himself a sort of global populist, and he's a fascinating mess of contradictions, including, unfortunately, being a fairly duplicitous man. But Washington, he's praising the revolution even while the heads are being lopped off. Washington notably keeps a portrait of King Louis XVI in the executive mansion after he's killed. And this is very controversial at the time, but it's actually just a rebuke to the French Revolution fanboys and a reminder that, we had real deep allies and our real allegiance was to the guy whose head's been lopped off. But all the foment around the French Revolution and the way that support for the French Revolution becomes the basis for the Democratic Republican Party. So foreign influence is baked in the cake of the beginning of the divisions of our country into a two-party system, which Washington wanted to push back on. So all these lessons are rooted in history and his own experience, but they're remarkably resonant. And what you have in the farewell address is his autobiography of ideas. Because the ideas are things he has cultivated over decades, and they have been hardened in the crucible of experience in the presidency. And that's why they have this diamond-like wisdom to them, even though at different times, different lessons will be applicable. But Washington was also too much a man of action to simply reflect on problems and warnings. He wanted to offer solutions, renewable sources of strength. And in the second section of my book, I called Washington's Pillars of Liberty. And that's a phrase he used a lot, pillars, the idea that it was holding up the edifice of the republic. But the word liberty is interesting. And I don't think we fully appreciate why the founders chose the word liberty. Freedom and liberty, same thing, right? Not quite. The founders understood that freedom could be a state of nature, but liberty required a degree of self-discipline. And that's what the business of self-government is about. It's all our business as citizens to take an active interest. And so in the renewing sources of strength Washington laid out for us, as well as warning about these larger historical trends that could take us down, preeminent was national unity. He wanted to build a national character. And he uses the word citizen and union and unity more than any other in the farewell address. Those are the two big ones. And remember, at the time, we have all these oversimplified notions about the nation, one of which is that, the nation wasn't even unified by the fact we all spoke English. In large swaths of upstate New York, they spoke Dutch. Up in Vermont, they spoke French. Germantown, outside Pennsylvania, Philadelphia, which is where the national capital was moved, on the way to moving it down the Potomac, well, they spoke German. There were deep divisions between the states, in addition to the people who thought of themselves primarily as Virginian or South Carolinian. And Washington wanted to push back on that quite acutely. He says in the farewell address that the name that unites us all, Americans, should be paraphrasing here, your first love. It should supersede any regional discriminations or nations of origin. He's very much wants to welcome new immigrants to the United States, but he's also very focused on the importance of assimilation. That he understands that national unity is key. He warns against regional divisions, regional identities, particularly, as I mentioned, regional political parties, because those could seed civil war, which he saw clearly even then. He warned about the importance of political moderation. We denigrate moderation today, I think deeply unwisely. But Washington and the Founding Fathers, moderation was not a pejorative. They understood moderation to be a source of strength, rooted in classical wisdom. Remember, within living memory of the founding generation, they had the example of the English Civil War. They had seen what happened when political parties became corrupt and polarized and demonized fellow citizens. And rooted in their understanding, really, of classical philosophy, they understood the value of the via media, the middle path, not giving in to extremes, the golden mean. And they were really passionate about the political philosophers who advanced it, Montesquieu in particular. And Washington desperately wanted to advocate a muscular moderation, a larger fight against factions, as a way to correct and balance those folks who would divide Americans against one another. That's a lesson we've lost. Fiscal discipline is the antidote to dealing with excessive debt. And he was very careful to say, he was convinced at the end, even though he always had a dim view of speculators, he liked investing in land more than stocks, that a little bit of debt he was convinced could be a very good thing for the nation. It helped us win the war, it helped us develop as a nation. But excessive debt, speculation, sort of an Icarus-like effect where people got overextended, is a disaster. And he warned in the farewell address that, there's a generational responsibility. We have to pay down our debts, not pass them on to posterity. And he said, and to pay down our debts requires taxes, which will always be, to some extent, inconvenient and unpleasant. It reminds me, there's a great Nixon quote about taxes, actually. It's one of my favorites. I'm trying to remember it right now. It's something about how, paying taxes is, it will never be, we can never make taxation popular, but we can make it fair, I think was his quote. And the point is the same. You got to deal with math, and no one likes to pay taxes, but it's essential if you're going to have a sense of generational responsibility, which is one of the big flow-throughs, certainly in his fiscal policy, but in all his politics. Washington was the least educated founding father, and he was acutely aware of that. He was actually insecure about his capacity to be president. He was very comfortable being a military man, and he loved being a farmer. But he knew that he wasn't an expert in issues like law and finance. And all the other founding fathers had gotten fancy college educations and spoke multiple languages. He only spoke English and barely got out of grade school. His dad died and he went to work as a surveyor. But as a result, he appreciated education in a way that perhaps people who've been denied it appreciate it most. And he was a deep autodidact. He read constantly. But he wanted to build a national university. And he wanted to build a national university as a way of counteracting regional prejudices, of creating that national character, of building a governing class, but also very interested in building an American form of arts and letters. He was really passionate about it. In fact, it was his obsession to build this national university, and it was one of the few places where Congress pushed back on Washington. And they were successful in doing so. Even though he helped purchase land in Washington once he got the capital, built on the Potomac, that was the thing he was most interested in, building a national university on the land that became the Naval Observatory where the vice president now lives. But Congress kept pushing back, and that's why we've got the University of North Carolina, the University of Virginia. There was never they never followed through on his idea. They did build his vision for West Point eventually, but not the National University. But the reason he was so passionate about education was because he understood that self-government depended upon enlightened public opinion. That's the phrase he uses in the farewell. Self-government requires an educated populace. And that's also something we can't take for granted. But remember, in the decline of Rome, the rulers had a word for what they'd use to distract and keep people, dumb it down, which is bread and circuses. Provide the people with bread and circuses, and they'll remain basically docile. But self-government requires vigorous citizens. It requires educated citizens. It requires enlightened opinion. And that requires education. He also was very aware of the importance of religion as a means to ensuring virtue and morality. Washington's vision of faith is sometimes oversimplified. He was certainly culturally Christian. He was raised Anglican, but he actually would never write the phrase Jesus Christ, never took communion. And this was the subject of some controversy because Martha always did. And a preacher a priest in Philadelphia called him out during a sermon for it indirectly. And he heard it and decided for reasons that are a bit more complex than simple pique that he wouldn't go back to that church. He realized that the priest was making a fair point, that he was setting an example. But he didn't want to change his behavior lest he be accused of political hypocrisy or using religion for political purposes. But what he was really passionate about, and is actually incredibly eloquent about, is the importance of religious pluralism. If you haven't read it, particularly those of you who are students, go back and read his letter to the Hebrew congregation in Newport, Rhode Island. It is one of the great documents in American history because he is passionate and eloquent about the idea that America will be a beacon of religious freedom and that folks will come here, and as long as they really participate in the culture, we want you here and we will respect your traditions because religious pluralism, he understood, made America stronger. There's an amazing letter he writes where they're looking for a new series of workers to hire at Mount Vernon, and he says, look, I don't care what religion they are, if they're Jewish, if they're Mohammedans, he uses the phrase in his own script for Muslims, or of no religion at all. That's fine. But he really elevates the idea of religious pluralism because he felt that religion is the most effective means for teaching virtue on a large scale, and that virtue and morality are absolutely necessary for a strong, functioning civil society. And so there too, you get, education. Lyndon Johnson used to love quoting the Washington's farewell on education. Reagan loved quoting it on religion. They did so at the Moscow State Address. And then, of course, his vision of a foreign policy of independence, which was very much rooted in the concept of peace through strength. Right? It was Washington's always balancing realism and idealism. That's very essential to his nature. He's trying to find that middle ground. But he wants America to grow strong, to be taken seriously on the world stage, and he doesn't want us to be a satellite of other great powers. And he understands the best way to do that is to be strong, economically and militarily. These are all solid, enduring pieces of wisdom. We need a new generation of Washingtonians to remember them. And it's worth remembering, too, that the speech was so central, it was such civic scripture, that it dominated debates for really the next 100 years. In the run-up to the Civil War, Andrew Jackson gives a farewell address, and the entire thing is basically a riff on Washington's farewell address, saying that the great man warned us against civil war. We now have established that our government works. Let's not forget he warned us here. The people arguing against civil war advocate for it. The Confederates try to reappropriate him for their own ends. Abraham Lincoln quotes the farewell address in his 1860 stump speech, and he requires the farewell address be read to Union troops in the middle of the Civil War to remind them what they're fighting for. And after the Civil War, it becomes mandatory teaching in public schools as a way of consciously binding the nation's wounds and creating a new culture that has a unifying text. And the farewell address was that text. It was memorized by school children. This is 6,000 words, folks. You think you got it bad with the Gettysburg Address? You don't. That's 272 words, 6,000 words, and it was standard operating speech, not only to be taught it, but to memorize it, to diagram it. In the run-up to World War I, there's a fascinating debate in the country about whether Washington would be okay with us getting involved in the Second World War, forget the League of Nations. And Woodrow Wilson's the president, and he's a Washington biographer. And he's squaring off against Henry Cabot Lodge, who had written a 4-volume biography of Washington. And a lot of their debate about the involvement in World War I and the League of Nations is these two men arguing about who's best representing Washington's original principles. And in the run-up of World War II, when FDR is, and here I get to be a little bit of a Hoover partisan, FDR is sort of preparing to do a double Washington apostate, right? He's going to violate the two-term tradition and get us involved in another world war at a much earlier stage. The farewell gets picked up by the America First crowd. That was what they were called then. It wasn't a term invented in this election cycle. Who people did not want America to be involved in the Second World War against Hitler. And there's a dark and disturbing point in the book, which there's some pictures about, which look like something out of a Twilight Zone or Dark Mirror episode. In February 1939, the German-American Bund holds a Nazi rally in Madison Square Garden. 20,000 people show up. And at the top of the stadium spread, there's a 30-foot banner of George Washington surrounded by swastikas. And the keynote speech is a guy trying to reappropriate and intentionally misinterpret George Washington's farewell address, saying he warned us against excessive debt. That's why I've got to stand up to all the spending, the New Deal. He warned us against religion. We needed religious principles, and he warned us not to get involved in foreign wars. The irony, of course, is that this odious appropriation of the farewell address is what Washington warned about, these pretend patriots. I mean, these guys are literally taking money from Adolf Hitler at the time, pretending to be really pure Americans who just happen to be German, and they're trying to, of course, argue Germany's interest, not the United States at the time. But that's really a mark where the reputation of the farewell address really starts to decline. It pops up at different times during the Nixon administration. It's fascinating. Some of the anti-Vietnam War protesters, particularly Gary Wills, write extended riffs about how they're representing Washington's real views in the farewell address, that we shouldn't be so invested in confusing South Vietnam's interests with our own. Lyndon Johnson quotes it all the time, mostly about education, as I said. Reagan constantly for liberty. Bill Clinton references it. And George H.W. Bush's farewell address, he references it at West Point. And in President Obama's farewell address, he quoted it at length. And I was in Chicago covering the remark, and he has an extended riff on the farewell address, quotes from it extensively. And Eisenhower, I should say, I skipped over Ike, and I love Ike, and that's not okay, because we're in his vice president's library. So let me backdrop for a second. Eisenhower's farewell is probably the most famous other farewell address, and he bases his farewell address explicitly on Washington's. I found some memos where the speechwriters are saying, like, we should base this farewell on Washington's, and I guess Eisenhower just read a book about Hamilton, and actually Brett Baer's book on Ike's farewell just came out the same day I did, so we sort of talked to each other a little bit about it. But that tradition, his warning against the military-industrial complex, is extended from the precedent Washington sent about a warning to future generations. And Eisenhower very much identified as Washington as a soldier, as someone who considered himself an independent, who thought about running for re-election as an independent, incidentally. But so it echoes on to today, and for President Obama, who hadn't quoted the farewell address up to that point in his presidency, his threat was threats to our democracy. And he's talking about the rise of a liberal democracy and, also, the rise of terrorism and the ways that those are fear-driven encroachments on freedom. But what's interesting is that he and Washington both ended up in a similar place on two things. First of all, for all their differences at different ends of the American experiment, Obama and Washington both, and most presidents have done this, I think recognize that national unity is preeminent. However they achieve the office, that once you achieve that office, that's one of your core responsibilities. That our independence as a nation is inseparable from our interdependence as a people. That's profound and it's important, but it's basic. And also that Washington emphasized the importance of vigorous citizenship. There's no replacement for it in a democracy. If you don't like the way things are going, if you do like the way things are going, it's not someone else's responsibility. It's all of ours. We all need to be engaged. We all need to straighten our civic backbone at all times. Complaining doesn't count. And there's that spirit of being the man in the arena, which I think Nixon constantly utilized. But that sense of Nixon coming from Yorba Linda to the White House because he had a sense of history, because he really cared about politics and policy, and he thought globally. I think he thought intergenerationally. And that's a spirit we can never have too much of. You know, democracy is not a given. When the founders came on board, everyone thought the democratic republics were doomed to fail. We have been the great exception that created the new rule. But it does need to be revived every generation, and it needs to be strengthened through an understanding of history and looking at those larger forces in the realization that we're not immune from them. We really have to commune with them. We have to learn from them and update them. And that's why I think this is Washington's farewell address remains so deeply relevant. It remains a document that I think can unite the left and right, that can really help provide a sense of common ground and common purpose at a time we need it, and provide a lens through which to make our own decisions going forward. So it remains the great vital document. And it's right there for us to rediscover. And it's a great story about how it was created and how it echoed. But its relevance really, really is striking. And we need to remember its wisdom now. So thank you very much. I'd love to take some questions.
Thank you, John. We do have time for a couple of questions. I know he's got to catch a flight out of LAX, so we want to make sure we get him there on time. But our first question,
my children thank you too.
This young man in the back row.
So many would say that Americans are uncompromising, but I would say that our greatest ability is our ability to compromise. In your opinion, what actions should America take right now to find this middle path or compromise that we need right now?
Well, we've fallen out of the habit. I think we sometimes use too simple a view of our past and the founders and ignore the fact that, for example, the Constitution was a principled compromise. The principled compromise is not an oxymoron. But I think we've fallen into a trap that extends from our partisanship and polarization in thinking that any compromise is a betrayal of principle and values. And it's just not the case. The Constitution is an extensive compromise. We're forged out of that. And a lot of those debates that even were evident at the Constitutional Convention before we became, there were political parties, were divisions that are resonant today. There are people who wanted a stronger central government, tended to be more urban, and there are people who were more rural who wanted to focus on states' rights, and they were concerned about federal encroachment of power on the way of life. Both sides legitimately think they're fighting for freedom. Washington wanted to help them find common ground. That's the spirit with which we need to do it. But I think both the politicians in Washington, who I think on some level, if you talk to them privately, understand this, but they feel that the base won't understand it, that they will be politically punished and lose close partisan primaries if they compromise. And so deadlock gets institutionalized. That's a relatively new problem. It's a direct extension of the rigged system of redistricting and open primaries. But the incentive structure right now is creating an environment, and I think partisan media is a big problem, part of it too, where politicians aren't necessarily doing what they know to be right when it comes to principled compromise. So I think we need to change the incentive structure, and that means showing up and rewarding those politicians who find ways to compromise in a principled way, to focus on the national interest. And those folks who are either too scared or too extreme to find common ground, those folks also need to be stood up to, regardless of what party they belong to. What else?
I have a question.
Sure.
You mentioned,
No, not you.
You mentioned his great understanding and of immigration and the importance of assimilation. What do you think he would say of the status of those two topics today?
So, I'm happy to discuss it. I'm always, there's always a bit of a reluctance. What would Washington say about, if he were alive today? And, I always remember, remember that caveman lawyer SNL sketch where, guy sees a plane and he goes, "Iron Bird." There are a lot of things that just he couldn't relate to today. But let's talk about the enduring principles and how they apply. With regard to the refugee ban, which is specifically, I think, what we're discussing right now, Washington was unambiguously in favor of religious pluralism. He saw it as a renewable source of strength, and that was rooted in immigrant groups coming here. The Hebrew congregation in Newport hadn't been there for 100 years. They found refuge, and Washington welcomed them as a matter of national policy. So it seems to me that Washington and the Founding Fathers wouldn't have been particularly, it's not a tough call, right? We welcome people of different faiths to this country. The one significant caveat being a focus on coming here and embracing your faith, but also embracing America. And I think that's a common sense balance that the vast majority of immigrants do. My grandparents were immigrants. That's why I'm so cheesily patriotic, because they taught me to appreciate it, and I had that example. But that's the American story. And when we forget that's most of our stories, then I think we buy into the us versus them that is never helpful for a strong democracy. So I think respecting that immigration is a renewable source of strength, really appreciating that religious pluralism, not notionally but actively, is a source of strength. And then also remembering that part of that is about assimilation, is about embracing Americanness. The phrase he uses in the farewell is citizens by birth or choice. So he was very clear that we had a lot of citizens of choice, and all he asked was make sure you're focused on what unites us as Americans, and that's preeminent in your mind.
We had one more question.
How about a softball like that? How about a
Our next question right here in front.
First of all, I enjoyed your appearance on the Bill Maher show.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
You talked about the importance of civics education and renewing that, the importance of a well-educated population. From my perspective, it seems like we're getting farther and farther away from that. As a practical matter, how do we bring about that renewal where, the young people growing up today understand Washington, Jefferson, Hamilton, everything you talked about? Because the farther we get away from it, the more it seems like we can have, a demagogue in the White House.
Look, this is one of the things I'm most passionate about is the importance of civic education and teaching history and using history to help understand our politics. In my own writing, when I write columns or I do commentary on CNN, I try to bring in as much history as possible because it just offers a little bit of perspective. We can learn a lot. We are not walking alone in this world. We do have the precedent of history to guide us, and we know how certain things turned out. That doesn't mean that we're prisoners of the past, but it should inform our decisions today. Particularly, I think, when you get to the level of values, by which I mean as, values in a what makes us American? How are we different? What are the lessons of our history? Where have been our best chapters and where have been our worst? FDR turning away the St. Louis, not our best chapter, which was a boat full of Jewish refugees during World War II. So let's not do that again. Teaching civics, though, is a real challenge because civics education has been both defunded and devalued. And I do think it's up to, again, all of us. No one's coming to save us, people. It's on us. Whether it's your local school board, whether it's just teaching history to your kids, whether it's finding new ways to make it creative and interesting, hang out a shingle, start a new web series for kids about American history and make $1 million, or supporting your local presidential library. I mean, I'm a history nerd, and my bride happens to be the great-granddaughter of Herbert Hoover, and so we spent a lot of time on that legacy, and it's a fascinating legacy. And there's a beautiful presidential library in the middle of West Branch, Iowa, and there's the Hoover Institution up at Stanford. Really supporting these locations and using them as community centers to learn about our history and to really inculcate that. But remember the bread and circuses point, because we can amuse ourselves to death. That's another word for it. Bread and circuses is amusing ourselves to death. And if we all of a sudden start elevating people without a sense of history, if we don't have a sense of history, if that's not guiding our conversation, we don't have to have an unrealistic standard and think that everyone's going to be walking around with, self-earned PhDs in American history. But it's about feeling a connection to the story. It's one of the reasons I thought the play Hamilton was so important. And actually, there's the song One Last Time, I interviewed Lin-Manuel for the book, and there's a great interview he gives, and he curses a lot, which I like. But his core point is the obligation we have to make the old stories new, and we can embrace the contradictions. Like, we don't have to think of the Founding Fathers as perfect. They're not. Let's not do them that disservice. When we understand them in their full complexity, they're more interesting. That makes their wisdom more accessible. That's one of the things I try to do in this book. But civics education, making the old stories new, making it so that we're actively using our history to guide us in the decisions we make, these are obligations, and they're not just obligations for professors and people in Congress. It's got to ripple up from the citizenry. We all have to lead by example, but it could not be more critical. You know, if there are people in the highest levels of government who don't know or seem to have an interest in history, that has a knock-on effect. You know, Harry Truman said the only thing new in the world is the history you don't know. So if you want to really be a strong advocate of self-government, if you want to be a really strong citizen, let alone a statesman, you've got to learn your history. It also happens to be fascinating.
We have time for one last one. We'll go back here.
Yes.
Sorry.
It's okay. Oh, you won't hold it? Okay. You were mentioning about the Founding Fathers and the commonality of values was important. And I guess you would probably...
Well, they had very differing opinions. It was not, I mean, they...
Okay.
But...
And also, I would believe that the Constitution was important as well, would you say?
Yes, but far from a settled document. I mean, as I tried to say, I mean, the debate over the Constitution and the ratification of the Constitution forms another one of the basis of what becomes the two-party system.
I guess the point I was getting at,
Yes.
you were talking about the refugee ban. I guess my biggest concern about, you mentioned before about immigrants coming in and what have you. One was relative common values. Two is Sharia law. Can you follow Sharia law and the Constitution? And would our founding fathers be comfortable with that? And also the treatment of women. Those are common values most immigrants before have, but some new wave of immigrants, this is a different value system.
I think that throughout much of history, the argument this time it's different usually ends badly in the rearview mirror. There were certainly people among the Founding Fathers who could have looked at immigrant groups full of Jewish people who were being persecuted and in exile, given the way that for many folks religion was a defining characteristic, although not all, we simplify that, and could have done all sorts of, the Jewish people are fundamentally different. I mean, I'm fine with an occasional Catholic, but the truth is there were some folks that weren't. You know, Washington had to actually send an order to his army against a perpetration of a Guy Fawkes Day celebration, which was anti-Catholic. I mean, remember, I mean, the Catholics faced severe discrimination, the Irish immigrants, when they came here. I mean, we see this story over and over, and that's why history is so important. Does assimilation matter? Yeah, it's part of the equation. That's absolutely true. But let's not forget the deeper truth, which is the accident of birth means that good people are that we are far more alike than we are different, whatever cultural lens we bring. And then if America's really working, assimilation occurs. You know, occasionally people come up to me and they say, "What are you?" And I say, "I'm American." And they say, "But what are your parents?" I said, "My parents were American. My grandparents came from Greece." So, "Oh, you're Greek?" "No, I'm American." And that's generally the process. Do we need to continue valuing, an emphasis on American culture? And sure, but if we do that at the expense of demonizing others, particularly immigrant others, we repeat a mistake that has never looked good in the rearview mirror of history. When we start thinking that certain groups of people are fundamentally different than the other folks who've come here before, because we've heard echoes of those arguments over and over, and they're always proven wrong. And look, I was Rudy Giuliani's chief speechwriter through 9/11. Like, I get the problem of terrorism in a very personal way. But I think to conflate that with Muslim immigrants, let alone refugees fleeing war, is a moral sin that's ahistorical. So when we think about the immigrants that are coming to this country or that came to the country during the founding, that's part of what's interesting. The European immigrants that we assume were all homogenized, they weren't, right? The Germans didn't want to learn English outside of Philadelphia. I mean, this has always been a process of becoming a more perfect union. And it's always going to be messy and difficult at times. What we do need to do is elevate our best ideas and our best ideals and say, let's all learn them and ascribe them, and let's make sure we've got a common currency of communication when it comes to civics and American history. Let's make sure we value that. That's the essence of American exceptionalism to me. That balanced with the idea that we're open to all who buy into our ideas and our ideals. So that's how I'd answer your question.
Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much.